Fiona! Fiona, can you go to her already? Norman slammed the phone down irritably. I'm insanely tired and she needs something again. She's feeling poorly once more. Mom? Fiona asked, tearing herself away from her book. Whitney. Whitney. Norman collapsed onto the couch. I'm fed up with her. Fiona, please go to her, for heaven's sake. I was there just a week ago. Well, I was there the day before yesterday, Fiona reminded him. Norman, but she wants to see you, not me. You're her son, and I'm just a daughter-in-law. Norman pulled his sweater over his head and tossed it onto the chair. Fiona sighed quietly. He never puts his things away. That's just how he is. He believes that homemaking is a woman's job, and a man's job is to bring in money. True, they both worked. But that wasn't an argument for Norman. And Fiona had to cook, clean, run errands, fold clothes, and handle other tasks that men consider insignificant and not burdensome. But there was nothing to be done. That's how Whitney raised him, except she didn't chew his food for him before putting it in his mouth. Fiona resigned herself to it. She loved her husband very much, and she tried not to annoy him unnecessarily. After all, his job was much more demanding than hers. Fiona was a preschool teacher. Norman often said it was easy for her, just wiping runny noses and getting kids to use the potty on time. But he was a car dealership administrator. So much to remember and know, understanding car brands, knowing how to approach each client, ultimately managing subordinates. Norman was terribly tired. At least that's what he said. After work, all he could do was play another game or watch TV. And Fiona really had the energy left for household chores, so she thought the responsibilities in their family were fairly distributed. Fiona, please, just go, Norman pleaded. We had a terrible backlog at work today. Well, you know, darling, she needs you. Fiona set aside her book. If you don't go, she'll call again. Sooner or later, she'll realize I don't have time for her. Norman smiled. Come on, Fiona. His smile always worked on her without fail. She got up from the couch and went to the closet. It was cold and windy outside. She needed to put on a warm sweater. All right, she sighed. I'll go now. What happened? She says she's feeling poorly. Norman stretched out on the now empty couch, crossing his arms behind his head. But I could tell from her voice she's lying. And if she's not? Fiona asked. Ah, Whitney, everyone's read the fable about the boy and the wolves. Sooner or later, trouble will come, and neither Fiona nor Norman will rush to help her. She's supposed to be a smart woman, yet she behaves like a little child, and Whitney is already 75. Fiona understood perfectly well that anything could happen at any moment. She could trip on the edge of the carpet, fall, break her hip, and then what? Fiona would have to take care of her. Norman definitely wouldn't cope with that. Or what if she had a heart attack, for example? Or even worse, a stroke. A person could lie in bed for years, requiring constant care. Norman often said he wouldn't allow strangers to look after his mother, so hiring a caregiver was out of the question, and they didn't have enough money for a caregiver anyway. They were saving up for an apartment. They themselves lived in a one-room apartment that Fiona inherited from her grandmother. A nursing home? Even more expensive than a caregiver. Fiona shuddered at the thought of what would come next. Of course, she was ready to take care of Whitney if necessary, but Fiona really didn't want that, especially since she was already 35. She had already devoted 7 years of her life to her bedridden grandmother. It was as if those years had been stolen from her. If her mother-in-law became bedridden for several years, what then? Then Fiona wouldn't have time to have children. Her age was already critical. And giving birth when you have to take care of an elderly sick person is not a great idea. No, Fiona wasn't ready for that. She remembered how difficult it was with her grandmother, and she was younger then. Norman pretended not to hear his wife's question. One could understand him too. He was already exhausted from work, and now his mother with her eternal problems. Fiona quickly got dressed, found the key to her mother-in-law's house, and left the apartment. It was only 2 stops to Whitney's place. Fiona decided to walk. She loved winter evenings. The yellowish light of the street lamps, the snow-covered trees, the hurried passers-by rushing home from work. Winter somehow sharpened the feeling that some miracle was about to happen. It was as if she were returning to childhood and waiting for Santa to bring her the coveted doll in a pink dress under the Christmas tree. It's strange. She's already quite old, but she still wants miracles. It's a pity Norman doesn't like giving gifts. For Christmas, he gave his wife a pot. Sure, Fiona definitely needed the pot, but for some reason, she felt a little disappointed. She gave her husband a gift certificate for a romantic dinner at a restaurant, and he even scolded her, calling it a waste of money. Maybe he was right, but Fiona really wanted to go to the restaurant. A colleague had told her about going with her husband, so Fiona thought of doing the same, a foolish, as it turned out, gift. Still, one has to consider the situation. They're saving up. But Fiona felt that once a year, they could afford to treat themselves. And Norman said that until they had a new apartment, there would be no restaurants. Nothing. She could still persuade him. The main thing was not to annoy Norman unnecessarily, to try to be a good wife. And Fiona tried, with all her might, and sometimes she even got tired of it. But what could she do? That's a woman's lot. She reached Whitney's house, climbed to the 5th floor, and rang the doorbell. For some reason, her mother-in-law didn't answer. Was she in the shower or something? Did she forget that demanded an urgent, immediate Norman visit? No, she couldn't have forgotten. Her son was the sunshine of her life. If she called him to her, she would sit by the door and wait for him to come. The young woman rang again. And again. Then she pressed her ear to the door. Silence. With trembling hands, Fiona began to insert the key into the lock. The key wouldn't go in, and she grew increasingly nervous. She wanted to think that Whitney had just left the house. Maybe she went to a neighbor's or to the store. Although no, Whitney didn't like going out in the evening. She was afraid of being robbed. About 20 years ago, some teenagers attacked her, tried to snatch her purse, but failed. They were scared off by a man walking his dog. Since then, Whitney never went out of the house in the dark. The lock finally yielded. Fiona pushed the door. "Whitney, hello, it's me," she shouted. Silence was the only response. Fiona's throat felt dry. Without taking off her shoes, she entered the living room. Her mother-in-law lay on the floor, clutching the telephone receiver in her hand. She probably wanted to call for an ambulance or her son who was now lying on the couch at home, watching TV. "Whitney!" Fiona sat down next to her mother-in-law and shook her by the shoulder. The elderly woman took a noisy breath, looking at Fiona with unseeing eyes. "My heart," she wheezed. "I think I fainted. Where's Norman?" "I'll call an ambulance right away," Fiona bustled. "She's alive. Thank God." The ambulance arrived in 5 minutes. Fiona went to the hospital with her. From the waiting room, the young woman called her husband. "Norman, your mother really wasn't feeling well," she said. "The doctors suspect it's a heart attack. They won't let me see her until they run some tests. Come here." "Why do I need to go there?" Norman was surprised. His voice seemed strangely indifferent to Fiona. After all, it was about his mother. "Fiona, listen. You know I absolutely hate all this medical stuff. When they took my blood, I almost passed out. The smell of hospitals makes me feel sick," he explained. Fiona felt ashamed. It's true, she's used to it after all those years with her grandmother. But him? He really does hate everything related to medicine. He says that when he was a child, he was in the hospital with pneumonia, and the injections were terribly painful. He would cry every time the nurse came into the room, so he's still afraid of the hospital smell. But still, he could make an exception for his mother. "Come, please," Fiona pleaded. "I'm scared here too." "What's there to be afraid of?" Norman raised his voice slightly. "Fiona, she's alive. That's the main thing. The doctors will do what needs to be done and send her home. Then I'll come. I have to work tomorrow, you know. Have to get up at 6, and it's almost 11 already. And it's your day off, by the way." "Yes, you're right," Fiona mumbled. I'll stay a bit longer, and then I'll come back and tell you everything. Okay, Norman said. Text me if you need anything. And anyway, maybe she's just pretending. No, Norman, she's not pretending, Fiona assured her husband. The doctor said that? But Norman didn't let her finish. The phone started beeping in her ear. Suddenly, Fiona felt uneasy. Who is she living with? Can you even do that? However much you fear hospitals, to not come to your own mother. Fiona put the phone in her bag and leaned back on the uncomfortable bench in the waiting room, specially designed, it seemed, to discourage anyone from sitting on it for too long. The backrest was too short, digging into her shoulder blades, and the angle was uncomfortable, making her lower back ache immediately. Busy nurses and serious doctors bustled past Fiona, while she sat motionless, waiting for the doctor. He promised to come out and tell her what happened to Whitney. The door kept opening, letting in teams of paramedics with patients, along with the icy air from the street. Fiona couldn't help but think that she might fall ill now, but she couldn't leave. She couldn't abandon her mother-in-law. Yes, she was terribly difficult, and Fiona openly disliked her. Although this could be explained by her love for her son, no daughter-in-law would ever be good enough for her. Never. But then, do mothers-in-law ever really love their daughters-in-law? With very few exceptions, everyone believes that their son deserved better. The only exception Fiona knew of was her friend Adria. Adria came to the city from the village after finishing school. She was quite a catch, with her blue eyes, beautiful hair, full lips, and rosy cheeks. Just like a doll. Adria got a job as a teacher in the same daycare where Fiona worked. And then she met Scoot, her future husband. Scoot was a successful businessman, dealing in either cosmetics or clothing. Fiona wasn't exactly sure. She knew Scoot earned very well. And he had a mother, a devout elderly woman who dedicated the remaining years of her life to pilgrimages and reading biographies of saints. She repeated that people should help others, even at their own expense. She didn't exactly dislike her daughter-in-law, she simply didn't pay attention to her. She had to accept her, since her son had chosen her. Then, Adria gave birth to a son, who was born with a genetic condition that affected his muscle development worse than other children. Doctors said the boy wouldn't walk. It would be good if he could crawl and learn to hold his head up. Adria almost went mad then. She traveled the country looking for doctors who knew how to treat her son's condition. She aged, cut her hair short, and for some reason, her blue eyes turned a dull gray. When the boy turned 1, Scoot declared that he wasn't ready for fatherhood and didn't want a disabled son. He kicked Adria out with a suitcase of clothes and their son in her arms. Adria had nowhere to go. She lived with Fiona for almost a month. Then she stayed with another friend. She didn't want to go back to the village. All she had left there was her alcoholic father. He regularly got drunk and lived in a half-ruined house. Of course, going there with a sick child was the worst option out of all the ones available at the time. And then Adria found out that she had no right to claim her ex-husband's property. He had 2 apartments, both of which he had wisely put under his devout mother's name. There was also a country house, but according to the documents, it belonged to Scoot's father, from whom his mother had long been divorced. So Adria was left with nothing, quite literally. Then Scoot's mother called Adria and invited her over, and Adria stayed with her. Suddenly, her former mother-in-law offered to help with the child, and Adria didn't refuse this help. She went to work while her grandmother looked after her son, and in the evenings, the 3 of them took walks in the park. Adria was afraid to ask about Scoot. She knew he had found another woman and was living with her. 2 years later, Scoot's mother passed away unexpectedly, and it turned out that she had left both apartments, which belonged to her, to Adria and her grandson in her will. The will stated that Adria needed the apartments more. Scoot was furious. He even tried to challenge his mother's decision in court, but he failed. The woman was of sound mind and aware of her actions. However, Scoot stopped paying child support immediately, but Adria didn't mourn over it. He was paying peanuts, barely enough for diapers. Adria eventually sold one of the apartments, using the money for her son's treatment, which helped him get back on his feet. And she lived in the other one, blessing her mother-in-law every day for her kindness. Though Fiona doubted Whitney would have acted similarly towards her. Fiona knew very well that her mother-in-law was terribly jealous of her son. It was evident to anyone, and no wonder. Fiona couldn't even be mad at Whitney, knowing her life story. Norman's mother spent her whole life working at the Creative Center, running a theater club. Once she had acting ambitions herself and even auditioned for roles. But after facing numerous rejections and receiving only one offer to appear as an extra, playing a girl in a swimsuit, she returned home and got a job at the Creative Center, where she worked until retirement. Whitney gave birth to Norman late, at the age of 40. She told her son that his father had left even before his birth and had no desire to communicate with the heir. She raised her son alone, barely surviving on a tiny salary, but she managed to raise Norman and give him a good education. Fiona deeply respected her mother-in-law for that, but love between them never blossomed. There was a certain chill from Whitney towards Fiona. No, she never directly stated that she was dissatisfied with her daughter-in-law, for instance, but she could make pointed remarks. Whitney always had a sharp tongue. Have you gained weight? Well, it's okay, it suits you. Although losing weight would be better, of course. After all, men like slim women. Isn't that right, Norman? She once said when the three of them were celebrating Christmas. After that, Fiona spent several weeks on a strict diet and even lost 3 kilograms, which soon came back. Dear, you're already 30. There's no need to wear such bright makeup, the woman would say when Fiona visited. You're trying to look younger. Men notice that and it seems funny to them. You're not a girl anymore. Men stay young until they're 60, but it's expected for us women to remember our age. Whitney seemed to just state facts, but after that, Fiona took a long time to recover. She would examine her body, for example, her face in the mirror, searching for signs of aging, and sometimes even cried. And Whitney also disliked that Fiona didn't have a higher education. For example, my son is an economist. I thought he would find a girl worthy of him, with whom he could have meaningful conversations. Oh well, some women are chosen not for their intellect, but for something else, a bit lower than the head. Whitney would bitterly sigh. Norman instructed Fiona to ignore his mother's words, but they still hurt her. So she tried to interact with Whitney less often. Fortunately, it wasn't difficult, as Whitney didn't have the habit of visiting her son and daughter-in-law without warning. Instead, she loved it when her son visited her. And to achieve that, the woman came up with various tricks. It all started 4 years ago when Whitney finally quit her job. Apparently, she got bored, and she began to feel a strong need to communicate with her son. Norman didn't share such a need. After work, he liked to have a hearty dinner and lie on the couch watching TV. Whitney quickly realized this and started coming up with all sorts of reasons to meet with her beloved son. At first, household appliances broke down. The stove wouldn't turn on, for example. The electric kettle would hiss strangely, and the vacuum cleaner mysteriously began to spit out dust instead of sucking it in. When Norman arrived, the appliances miraculously fixed themselves. After some time, Norman stopped coming to his mother for such trivial reasons. So, she came up with something more interesting. Lost keys, suspicious noises in the stairwell, a drunken neighbor trying to break in. The keys were found, the noise disappeared even before Norman arrived, and the neighbor sobered up and returned to his own apartment. Then Norman started asking Fiona to run errands for his mother. "It's not hard for you after work," he said. "What's going on with her now? Go and check." And Fiona would run to Whitney's to make sure everything was okay again, seeing a slight disappointment on the woman's face. It was understandable. She wanted to see her son, her pride and the meaning of her life, not her unsuccessful daughter-in-law. But when Norman did come, there was no limit to the joy. Tea and cake appeared on the table. Whitney beamed with happiness, and problems seemed to solve themselves. "Oh, it's you," Whitney said, seeing Fiona. "And where's my son? What, couldn't he make it again?" "He's just very tired," Fiona sighed. He asked me to come to you. They're swamped at work, and as soon as he came home, he fell asleep." And such conversations repeated over and over again. Sometimes Fiona desperately wanted to say that Norman simply didn't want to come and ask Whitney to leave their family alone, but she knew she'd never do it. After all, she felt sorry for Whitney. A lonely woman, she surely missed her son terribly and would want him to live with her, not his wife. But Whitney probably couldn't even admit that to herself, so she invented problems every day just to see Norman. It's still unclear what kind of mother Fiona herself would become, if she became one, of course. Norman categorically didn't want children. True, Whitney didn't know about it and, for some reason, was convinced that she didn't have grandchildren solely because of Fiona, who, for some reason, didn't want to fulfill her maternal potential. Apparently, to spite Whitney, Fiona wouldn't fulfill herself as a mother. Realizing that her son didn't want to spend evenings with her, Whitney started complaining about illnesses. Norman simply couldn't refuse an elderly woman with a heartache or aching legs, at least not at first. But then he realized that his mother was manipulating again and demanded Fiona to make Whitney undergo a full medical examination. Fiona spent several weekends on this. Whitney resisted as much as she could, but Norman managed to persuade her. And it turned out that Mom was relatively healthy, slightly elevated cholesterol, and varicose veins aside. But it didn't work. Whitney decided that the doctors simply missed something, and she continued to call her son almost every evening, claiming that her life was hanging by a thread, and she was about to die in terrible agony. Norman refused to visit her. Sometimes Fiona managed to persuade him to visit his mother. Norman did so reluctantly, but sometimes he agreed. If he didn't want to go, Fiona rushed to Whitney. She understood that her mother-in-law was healthy and just bored. But what if something really happened and nobody was there to help? Fiona knew she wouldn't forgive herself for not helping her mother-in-law. Norman even chuckled at her sometimes. "She's manipulating. I know her," he said. "Fiona, you need to learn to say no." "But how, dear?" she sighed in response. "Anything could happen." "Oh, Fiona. Nothing will happen to her. She'll outlive us all." And then Fiona's fears became a reality. Whitney really fell ill. It's a good thing she came. The paramedics said that if Whitney hadn't received help in time, she could have died. But why was Norman so indifferent? Fiona could understand if Norman was cold to her, to his wife. It's just his character. Nothing can be done. But his own mother? Fiona didn't remember her own mother. She was raised by her grandmother. Fiona loved her grandmother with all her heart. Perhaps she loves her mother even more. Her thoughts about family ties were interrupted by the doctor. "All right, everything will be fine with your mother-in-law," he said, "but she'll have to spend a couple of weeks here in the hospital." "Thank you. Can I see her?" Fiona asked. "She's asking for her son." The doctor glanced around. "Is he here?" "You see, my husband didn't come." Fiona lowered her gaze. He's very busy." The doctor's expression darkened. "Oh, so busy that he can't visit his own mother in the hospital, is that it?" Fiona didn't respond to the doctor. "All right, let's go," the doctor sighed. "At least you talked to her. Explain that her son is busy. It's good that at least you came." Whitney was in the intensive care unit, but Fiona was allowed to see her. The nurse gave her a gown and warned her not to disturb the patient. "You have 5 minutes," the nurse said. "No more." The young woman nodded and entered the vast room filled with beds and medical equipment. She immediately spotted Whitney lying in the corner, staring at the ceiling. Fiona approached slowly. "Whitney, hello, how are you?" "Fine." Her mother-in-law shifted her gaze to Fiona. "Is Norman coming?" "Norman will come tomorrow," Fiona promised. "He just fell asleep already." Oh Lord, what is she talking about? And he didn't even let the fact that his mom ended up in intensive care disturb his sleep. Understood. Whitney weakly smiled. "Ask him to come. I really want to see Norman. I was afraid I'd die without ever seeing my son again." "You'll see him?" Fiona gently squeezed her mother-in-law's hand. "And you'll see him again." "Yes, I hope so." Whitney unexpectedly squeezed Fiona's hand in return. "Thank you. Thank you for coming, dear." "Well, how else could I?" Fiona felt like she was about to cry. "You called after all." They talked a little more. Fiona promised to bring Whitney some oranges and her favorite chocolate bars, if the doctor allows it. Then the young woman headed home. Norman was already asleep. Fiona decided to have some tea. In the kitchen, she found a sink full of unwashed dishes. Fiona was angry. He could have washed the dishes. Darn it. He knows that Fiona can't stand it when the dishes are left overnight. She had such a thing. The kitchen had to be perfectly clean in the morning. Otherwise, Fiona would be in a terrible mood all day. After all, she didn't go to meet her friends in the end, but went to Norman's mother in the hospital. While Fiona was washing the dishes, she didn't feel like sleeping. She poured herself some tea, sat on the couch, and started to think. I wonder why Norman is like this? Probably, his mother spoiled him as a child. When they first started living together, Fiona was amazed that Norman didn't know how to do anything at all. He couldn't even heat soup on the stove, didn't know how to turn on the washing machine, didn't understand how much detergent to pour on the sponge to wash one plate. His mother did everything for him. Norman was only supposed to study well, and that's it. Fiona tried to teach Norman at least something, but household chores always won over him. Sometimes Fiona felt like he was doing it on purpose to get his wife to leave him alone. After burning another pot, Fiona gave up and decided that it was easier to take care of the household chores herself than to teach her husband anything. Fiona even found a suitable term that perfectly described Norman, a domestic invalid, like, "The person has hands and legs in place, he's capable of working, but when it comes to cleaning or washing dishes, he loses all his skills and turns into a helpless child." And despite all this, Fiona loved Norman. She considered herself lucky with her husband, educated, handsome, with a great sense of humor, earning decently. He chose her. Fiona wasn't prone to overestimating herself. She was ordinary, without higher education or outstanding talents. She was raised by her grandmother. Her mother gave birth to her early, at 20, by a classmate with whom she had a short but passionate romance. She didn't need the child, and she literally handed Fiona over to her mother and went to another city to find her place in the sun and be away from her daughter. Fiona saw her mother only a couple of times in her life. She came when Fiona started first grade. And one more time, on her 10th birthday, she had her own life, and Fiona had hers. Fiona perceived her mother as a stranger, bustling, emotional, and incomprehensible. The woman would come, give her daughter modest gifts, make her sit on her lap, and kiss her cheek every minute. Fiona remembered her mother poorly, but her scent lingered in her memory, sweet, pungent, and slightly irritating. Meanwhile, her mother repeated that she loved her daughter, that she was the meaning of her life, and that she would definitely take Fiona with her when the time came. But that time never came. When Fiona turned 15, her mother passed away. It was her then-boyfriend behind the wheel that night. Apparently, he had drunk too much and lost control. When Fiona turned 16, her grandmother had a stroke. She fell ill, and the next 8 years became a nightmare for Fiona. She took care of her grandmother, worked odd jobs, and gave up her dream of going to university. Fiona dreamed of becoming a translator, but she went where it was easiest, to a pedagogical college located just a few steps from her home. She graduated from it and got a job at a kindergarten. Money was barely enough. The grandmother received a tiny pension, and Fiona was earning pennies. When she turned 25, the nightmare ended. Her grandmother passed away. And then Fiona met Norman. They met on the street. Fiona was coming home from work. It was raining heavily. Norman caught up with her and offered his umbrella. Fiona would have refused, but she liked this guy, so charmingly smiling at her and holding the umbrella over her head. They went to a cafe for a cup of tea. They started talking. Norman asked for Fiona's phone number. After a little thought, she wrote it down on a napkin, and that's how their romance began. It turned out that Norman lived near Fiona with his mother. He joked that thanks to this, it would be much easier for them to go on dates. Fiona felt that their proximity was a sign. Perhaps he was the man fate had destined for her. Just 6 months after they met, they got married, and Norman moved in with Fiona. They renovated their place and started saving money to buy a bigger apartment. Fiona was happy. She believed that Norman was a gift from fate for all those years she had cared for her grandmother. Sleepless nights, ambulance calls, the whims of a sick person, the unbearable smell of medicine, all that was in the past. Now, she was free. Fiona felt a little ashamed to think that way, as she loved her grandmother and didn't wish her death, but she was terribly tired of taking care of a bedridden person. Now, she had a loving and beloved husband, their own home, and the opportunity to fulfill her main dream to become a mother. However, Norman didn't want children. He said they needed to live for themselves first and buy a bigger apartment. Fiona understood he was right. Their apartment was a bit cramped. There wasn't even enough space for a crib. Time passed. The money they saved seemed to disappear too quickly. Sometimes, Norman needed to upgrade his car. Sometimes he suggested going on vacation, saying that you only live once and need to see the world, and sometimes his mother, Whitney, fell ill, and they had to pay for doctors and medicine. Fiona was afraid she wouldn't have time to have a baby. When she turned 35, she brought up the topic again, but Norman suddenly said they might not need to become parents. "Why do you need this? Are you unhappy?" he wondered. "A child is a burden, and my mom is old already. God forbid something happens to her." "Are you suggesting we wait until something happens to her?" Fiona blurted out. "It sounds cynical, but yes," Norman replied. "But I'm already getting older, Norman. You know, the older I get, the more difficulties there will be," she said quietly. "I read that with each passing year, the chances of having a child with a genetic disorder increase. Oh, come on. Medicine is advancing," he said cheerfully. "Don't worry, we'll make it. And if we don't, it's okay, just you and me. If you want, we can get a cat or a dog." And Fiona realized her husband didn't want children. If he did, neither the presence of his elderly mother nor the small apartment would stop him. But she loved Norman too much. So, Fiona was left to accept it and hope that her husband would change his mind. But her inner voice whispered that Norman had time. A man in his 60s could become a father and leave Fiona for a younger woman. And then she would be left alone with nothing. But Fiona didn't want to listen to that voice. What's the point of leaving Norman? She wouldn't find anyone else anyway. She wasn't the right age anymore, and, frankly, she didn't have the most attractive appearance. And she wouldn't love anyone the way she loved her Norman. But sometimes, Fiona felt like Norman wasn't her person. He never gave gifts just because, without any reason, and if he did give something, it was only for holidays. And usually, it was practical items for the house, like pots, a mop, a baking dish, or towels. He didn't believe in flowers, considering them a waste of money. Fiona sometimes bought bouquets herself, and Norman always scolded her for it. So, the young woman did it less and less. Sometimes, looking at herself in the mirror, she thought that perhaps she wasn't worthy of flowers. Flowers were given to beautiful, alluring women, those who knew their worth, women worth fighting for. And she was just ordinary, a bit plump, with round cheeks and already visible wrinkles. Once Fiona tried to change something, dyed her brown hair copper red. Norman then said she looked like a clown. Fiona cried all evening and then dyed her hair back to chestnut. There was no brightness in her, no charm, and there wouldn't be any more. Her grandmother often said, "Some are loved, and others are married." They love the bright, sexy, confident ones. But they marry the workhorses, the women you can rely on, who will provide you with dinner, comfort, and care. But they won't love them. After all, no one loves a vacuum cleaner for cleaning dust or a stove. And as the years went by, Fiona realized more and more that moving from one category to another was practically impossible. In the morning, Norman found Fiona in the kitchen. She had been sitting there all night with a cup of tea in her hands, staring out the window. "What? Didn't you go to bed?" Norman asked. "I was too anxious," Fiona lied. "Could you make an omelet?" he asked. "I have to go to work. We have some unscheduled meeting today. Can you believe they scheduled it for Saturday?" "Yes, I'll make it." She nodded. Norman had breakfast and hurried off to work, giving Fiona his usual peck on the forehead. After he left, she called the hospital. The doctor asked her to come in. "Is something wrong?" the woman asked, concerned. "Well, we need to talk," the doctor vaguely replied. "Come over." Fiona, instead of starting the planned Saturday cleaning, got dressed and called a taxi. On the way, she prayed to herself. She just hoped history wouldn't repeat itself with Whitney. She hoped Whitney would recover. Fiona was ready to buy any medication, to send Whitney for any treatment, even the most expensive ones. They had savings for a new apartment with Norman. To hell with them. There are things more important than a new apartment or a new car. But the news turned out to be much worse than Fiona expected. The doctor invited her into his office. She sat on a chair, feeling everything inside her turn cold. From the doctor's face, she understood that he wasn't going to reassure her. "So, listen, your mother-in-law has cancer," he said. "What?" Fiona couldn't believe her ears. "Yes, we found it by accident. It's stage 3, with metastases in the stomach. The woman has a maximum of 6 months left. No one dares to perform surgery. Maybe chemotherapy can slow down the process. But I must tell you, the treatment won't be pleasant." "But she never complained about her stomach?" Fiona whispered. "Only about her heart." "That's normal. Sorry, but your mother-in-law is a typical hysteric. She loves to draw attention to herself," the doctor bitterly smiled. "Our nurses are already tired of her. Hysterics complain about their hearts or headaches, never about hemorrhoids or nausea. Understand, cancer may not have pronounced symptoms, like hers, especially if it affects the stomach." "And what now? Does she know about the diagnosis?" Fiona asked. "We wanted to tell her in the presence of her relatives. Will her son come?" Yes, of course." Fiona nodded. "I'll call him right away. May I leave?" The doctor nodded. Fiona went out into the corridor and dialed Norman's number. He didn't answer. Damn this cursed meeting. What do they always discuss there? Sometimes it gets delayed for hours. Sometimes he has to go on a Saturday. Are they planning to take over the world there? Norman answered his wife on the third attempt. "Yeah, what?" he said irritably. "Didn't I tell you I'm busy? Is the bread finished or something?" "Norman, your mom has cancer," Fiona replied. "The doctor told me." "Where from?" "He's confusing something." "No, they double-checked everything. It's stomach cancer, Norman. It's too late to do anything but try to slow down the process." "Oh, damn it," the man sighed. "Come over," his wife pleaded. "We need to tell her. It's better if you're there, Norman." "Fiona, I can't. We have a meeting right now, and I'm not ready. I don't know, maybe you?" Fiona looked at the screen in bewilderment, as if she could see her husband's face through it. Was he out of his mind? "Me? Norman, you're the son, and I'm nobody," Fiona said quietly. "You have to come, Norman." "Listen, Fiona, I can't. I just can't handle it." "Fiona, sweetheart, how about you? I'll come by tomorrow, okay?" "I can't. I'm telling you honestly." I understand," Fiona sighed. "Norman, but this isn't right." "Understand, Fiona, I'm scared," he admitted. "Fiona, you have more experience in these matters after all." "Okay." She looked thoughtfully out the window. I'll handle it." She pressed the end call button and pocketed the phone. Unexpected. Norman, of course, was not a model of bravery. She knew that perfectly well. Whenever there was a need to call someone and argue, he always passed the responsibility on to her. Fiona tended to think of it as a display of gentleness. Turns out, Norman was just a coward. This thought struck Fiona. But she didn't want to think about it now. It wasn't the time. And she could understand him. His mother was very seriously ill. He was scared. Fiona remembered herself when she found out her mother had died. She was in a state of shock. She cried for a week, then couldn't pull herself together for almost a year. And yet, she didn't really know her mother, didn't remember her. But still, she was her own flesh and blood. And her grandmother? Fiona was mentally prepared for her death and understood that sooner or later it would happen. But how bad she felt when she found her grandmother in bed one morning, cold and lifeless. It was as if a part of herself died along with the old woman. Fiona, a wife. A loving wife, she had to do this to help her husband. To take this burden off him. Maybe then he would understand that she was worthy of flowers, worthy of a dinner at a restaurant. The woman returned to the doctor's office. "I can tell her," she said firmly. The doctor nodded. "Okay, I hope you can choose your words carefully. Should I come with you?" No, there's no need. I'll handle it." She forced a smile. No! It seemed like it went poorly because genuine sympathy appeared in the doctor's eyes. "Do you remember the room? If anything, call." Fiona walked out again and deliberately slowed her pace as she headed towards the ward where her unsuspecting mother-in-law lay. Whitney was sitting on the bed, reading a magazine. "Fiona? Is Norman coming?" She brightened up at the sight of her future daughter-in-law. He doesn't even visit her own mother. Fiona sat on a chair beside her mother-in-law. "He works a lot, you know. Today, for instance, they have a meeting. He'll come tomorrow, probably, and we need to talk." Whitney listened to her with a strange calmness, as if they were discussing the plot of some silly TV show rather than the health of an elderly woman. Fiona finished. Her mother-in-law stared through her, silent. The silence was frightening. She'd prefer if Whitney cried or screamed, or demanded something, like better doctors, her son, urgent rechecks of the diagnosis. "How are you?" Fiona asked. Whitney smiled calmly. "No one lives forever, dear, but how did I miss it? Although, why am I surprised? My mother also died of stomach cancer. They say it's hereditary." "But surely something can still be done," Fiona reassured her. "There are drugs now, and money is not a problem. Norman and I have some savings." Whitney placed her hand on Fiona's knee. "I don't want to. I know what that treatment entails. I don't want to torment my son or you. You're still a good one. I understand that Norman was just scared. He's always been like that, Fiona. You know, I used to go to his school to solve his problems. And then I went to college for him, too." "But he didn't say anything," Fiona blurted out. "Who talks about such things?" Whitney laughed. "Especially to a wife. Fiona, I just want to ask you one thing. I can't do it to Norman. You'll understand why when I tell you. I want you to find his father." "What?" Fiona couldn't believe her ears. "But he's supposed to be dead." "Norman said so." "I lied to him." Whitney began smoothing out the folds on the blanket with her palms. "He just left. He didn't even know I was pregnant. I never told him. I was too proud back then. Now I regret it. I want Norman to know the truth and meet his father. If Matt is alive, of course. I thought I could handle everything myself. But maybe it wasn't meant to be. I also want to talk to him myself. I've loved him all my life. Missed him. Got angry, but still missed Matt." "But, Whitney, how do I find him? I don't know anything about him," Fiona said, flustered. "I don't really know much myself," the woman sighed. "I'll tell you what happened, and you try at least. Maybe we'll manage to see him. Surely, he won't refuse a dying old woman?" By the age of 39, Whitney had despaired of finding her significant other. Perhaps it was her age, or maybe it was her character. Yes, her character was indeed quite complex. Men who showed interest in her quickly ran away. Whitney firmly decided for herself that she would either find the perfect husband or remain alone, and she didn't forgive imperfections. She could easily break up with a guy if he was even 5 minutes late for a date or came, for example, without a bouquet of flowers, or if his shoes weren't polished to a shine, or if he earned too little, or made mistakes in his speech. There were a lot of criteria for her. Many warned Whitney that she was too demanding, that she would end up alone in the end, but she believed it was better to be alone. She had seen enough of her friends suffering with husbands who didn't bring home a penny, couldn't fix a socket, weren't decisive, and weren't capable of doing something extraordinary for their loved ones. Even flowers. Flowers were a rare occurrence, given to their women only once a year. And yet her friends were happy with those tattered cheap roses. Whitney was not willing to waste her time on trivialities. She continued to wait, and she waited. She met Matt. He happened to stop by the creative workshop where she worked. Whitney was just about to leave. It was evening. The theater club session was coming to an end. The man asked her how to get to the hotel. She explained, noting that her interlocutor was quite attractive. Around 35, 40 years old. A contemporary. Nice jacket, jeans. That means he earns well. His shoes were polished to a shine, just the way she liked. These details gave Whitney full reason to offer her services to the man. "Do you want me to walk you there? It's not far," she smiled. "With pleasure. I wanted to ask, but I hesitated. I thought such a beautiful woman wouldn't want to spend her precious time on me. My name is Matt," he said. "Whitney, very nice to meet you." She nodded and extended her hand, encased in a suede glove. "Let's take a walk. It's very beautiful here." On the way, they struck up a conversation. It turned out that Matt was an engineer who had come to the city on a business trip. "And what about your belongings?" she wondered. "Oh, I'm used to traveling light. I only have a small bag with me. Left it in the luggage storage," he replied. "I'm only here for 4 days. I'll check how our developments are being implemented at your optical plant. And then back home." Whitney was a little disappointed. Just 4 days. What a nuisance. They wouldn't even have time to get to know each other. When they reached the hotel, the man suddenly offered, "I'm working until 5 tomorrow. Can I take you somewhere after that? Can I take you somewhere? Your choice, my treat, of course." Whitney mentally gave him another plus. Decisive and generous. So far, not a single flaw. It seemed like luck was finally on her side. "Sounds good. Meet me after work. I'll be finished by then," she replied. They met the next day as planned, at 5 o'clock. Whitney wore her favorite dress, did her makeup and hair. "Let's go to Cleopatra. It's the best restaurant in town," she said. "But it's a bit pricey. We can choose somewhere else if you prefer." This was also a test on her part. Will he hesitate or ask to go somewhere cheaper? And Matt didn't hesitate. "Great. I don't like to skimp, especially in the company of such a lovely lady," he said, taking her hand. It was a bold gesture that Whitney also liked. "Let's call a taxi. It'll be faster." In the morning, they woke up in the same bed. Whitney invited the man to her place, and he understood correctly. She wasn't afraid to rush things, as they were both adults. Whitney had a case once. The guy seemed perfect and well off. She invested 4 months in him, and then it turned out he couldn't do anything at all. She had to come up with a reason to break up with that specimen. But Matt was different. Besides, he wasn't married. Well, he was, but it had been a long time ago. He had already divorced his wife. Whitney didn't ask about children. Why would she care? Even if he had them, the man clearly had enough money to pay alimony and not be broke. The business trip came to an end. He promised to come back in a couple of weeks. This was also a test for Whitney. If he didn't come, it meant she just had a nice time with an interesting man. But if he did come, well, it turns out she finally got what she waited for. Matt came. This time, not to the hotel, but to Whitney's home. They spent 3 wonderful days together. As he was leaving, he announced that he planned to move to her city permanently. "I've already found a job offer. Great salary, even better conditions than before. Destiny sent you to change my life," the man said with a smile. "You know, It's very strange. But I have a feeling that I was waiting and looking for you, Whitney. Yes, maybe we were both looking for each other, Whitney replied. They moved in together. The woman was over the moon with happiness. The man was the ideal she had imagined, and no one else believed in. Kind, hardworking, well-groomed, and even in bed, he was fantastic. So what if she was almost 40? It's better to find such a man at 40 than to spend life with just anyone. Matt's new job involved a lot of business trips. Perhaps this was the only thing that truly saddened Whitney. He would leave for a week or two. She waited for him, deep down fearing that her perfect man would find a woman he liked more in another city. But he always came back, bringing her expensive gifts. A ruby ring, a silk nightgown, a mink coat. They lived together for 6 months. Perhaps those were the best 6 months of her life. She hoped he would propose soon, dropping hints about wanting to wear an elegant white dress. Her beloved understood the hints correctly and replied, "I understand. Everything will happen, darling, but a little later." Then he left on another long business trip, for a whole month, and he didn't come back. He stopped calling, didn't write letters. Whitney even went to his workplace to find out if everything was okay with him. It turned out that he came to pick up his documents and submit a resignation letter. That's when Whitney realized she had been wrong. Apparently, she wasn't that needed by this man if he left her. She felt empty, offended, and humiliated. But Whitney didn't allow herself to dwell on these feelings. It's okay. It will pass. She's strong. She'll forget about him and move on. Whitney threw away his things and letters, pawned the gold ring he gave her, cut the silk nightgown with scissors, and gave the fur coat to a colleague. But she couldn't forget Matt. Soon after his disappearance, Whitney realized she was pregnant, and she couldn't get rid of this gift. All possible dates for abortion had passed, and Whitney resigned herself to becoming a mother. And when her Norman was born, Whitney's world turned upside down. She loved her son with all her heart, as if all the love she was supposed to spend in 40 years of her life now poured out onto him alone. The boy was the meaning of her existence, her greatest joy. She didn't expect to feel such feelings. When she admired her son, time seemed to stand still. In the world, there were only she and her son. She even forgot about Matt. Almost forgot. She only remembered him occasionally. What if something bad happened to him? Should she try to find him? Tell him that he has a son growing up? He wanted children. He often said he had such a dream, a boy just like him, like 2 peas in a pod. And why is it so important for all men to have an heir, even if they haven't made a fortune? The thought of finding her former beloved man, Matt, was quickly dismissed by Whitney. He wasn't worthy. If something happened to him, there are 2 options. If he died, there's no point in looking for him anymore. If he's alive and doesn't get in touch, then she doesn't need to do that. And she continued to live her life, only occasionally reminiscing about her great love. One day, when Norman was 16, she received a letter with no return address. Matt wrote that he had made a terrible mistake and wanted to correct it. Whitney's heart almost melted from his words. He left her his phone number and asked her to call. He wrote that he loves only her and is ready to explain everything. But still, Whitney didn't call. Too much time had passed. She was scared. Scared that her Norman would love his father more than he loved her. That he would take her son away, and her son, by the way, was Whitney's main treasure, the meaning of her life. And Whitney threw away the letter. No, he who betrayed once will betray again. And now, standing on the brink of death, she suddenly realized that she wanted to see Matt and tell him about their son. She suddenly realized that she had made a mistake. Norman has the right to know that he has a father. Fiona listened to her mother-in-law without saying a word. "And how do I find him?" she asked. "Is there anything left?" "Matt Beecham," Whitney replied thoughtfully. "There's only one photo and some documents left. Everything is kept at my place, Fiona. You have the keys. Just don't tell Norman anything. I don't want to upset him." Fiona sat with Whitney a little longer and then went home. Yes, Love for one's child is a strange thing. Whitney was ready to forgive Norman everything. It seems that even if he robbed her apartment, she would find plenty of excuses for him. And she didn't want to worry her son, without thinking that Fiona might not have time to search for this Matt. Yes, he disappeared more than 30 years ago. How old is he now? About 75. He and Whitney were the same age. He could be anywhere, in another city, in another country, in the cemetery eventually, or maybe quietly living in some distant village, unaware of the sorrow. You can't refuse Whitney. You could say it's her last request. When Fiona returned, Norman wasn't home yet. She prepared lunch, did some tidying up, and then took a shower. Then Norman came. "Hey, honey, is there something to eat? I'm dead tired," he shouted from the corridor. "Of course there is," the wife replied. "Norman, go to the kitchen." She set the table, sitting across from her husband. "I'm sorry I'm late. The boss has completely lost it. Keeps coming up with one thing after another." "Norman, aren't you interested in your mother's condition at all?" Fiona asked. "What do you mean interested?" He frowned. "Well, I thought we'd talk about it later. What's wrong?" "And there everything is bad, Norman. Apparently not long left." Fiona toyed with the tablecloth with her finger. Should she tell him about Whitney's request? Or is it too early? How does he manage to remain so indifferent? Or is Norman really indifferent? "Yeah, I understand. But there's nothing that can be done, right?" he asked. "Apparently, yes, Norman. Talk to your mother. She doesn't want any treatment," Fiona said, looking her husband straight in the eye. "And one more thing. Norman, I'm taking a week off and going away. Maybe tomorrow it'll become clear." "Wait, where are you going?" The man frowned. "I'm going to a friend's. She urgently needs help. Her mother is also ill," Fiona lied. "Are you going to leave me alone with my sick mother?" Norman pushed his plate away and frowned. "Fiona, how should I understand this?" "Norman, I'll be gone for a short time. Calm down. Nothing will happen during this time." She shrugged. "My friend also has problems. As I said, her mother fell ill. She needs help. She's all alone." "So, her mother is more important than mine?" Norman raised his voice slightly. "Am I understanding you correctly, Fiona? You're actually needed here right now." "Norman, nothing will happen. Calm down. If you visit Whitney a couple of times during the week, that'll be enough. She's in the hospital, under the doctor's supervision," Fiona replied. "I don't have time to visit. You know I have a lot of work." He pursed his lips, looking at his wife with incomprehension. "So this is how you love me, huh? You're leaving me?" "Finish eating," Fiona said. "I'll wash the dishes." She went to the living room and sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. Who does she really live with? Is he truly so infantile and spoiled, or does he just not care? Fiona knew that Norman valued comfort above all else. He often repeated it himself. Maybe that's why he doesn't want children. With kids, there won't be comfort, especially in their small one-bedroom apartment. At least not initially. But he could at least pretend not to be so selfish, but that's not possible. Or maybe it's not selfishness, but fear. The fear of a little child who's afraid to face the reality where people get sick and die. And sometimes those people are your loved ones, the ones you love the most in the world. Fiona knows how terrifying and difficult it is. But what about Norman? Whitney shielded him from all troubles. She somehow told Fiona that when Norman's old cat died of old age, she simply took him out to the trash and miraculously caught another identical cat. Norman was already 14, not a little kid. And the boy didn't even notice the switch. Whitney told this story with a laugh like, "Look what a good mother I am. Tried so hard for my son." But Fiona was surprised by her mother-in-law's behavior. Sooner or later, we all encounter death. And one of a mother's tasks is to prepare her child for the fact that life doesn't always resemble a fairy tale with a happy ending. But It's not the time now to think about what Norman feels. He's a grown man. He'll manage. And he'll forgive her when he finds out the reason for her departure, which might not happen at all. Norman slept in the kitchen that night. The next morning, Fiona went to her mother-in-law's apartment. She said the documents were kept in the desk drawer, and Fiona quickly found what she was looking for. In a regular envelope was a photo of a man who looked just like Norman, like 2 drops of water. The man in the photo was smiling joyfully, with noticeable dimples on his cheeks. Yes, Whitney could be understood. It's easy to fall in love with someone like him at first sight. Fiona also found his ID card, so at least she knows his name and birth year. She put the photo and ID card in her bag. Then she opened the closet, packed some warm clothes for Whitney into a bag. The hospital was cold. Fiona didn't want her mother-in-law to freeze. After thinking a little more, she put a few books from the table near the couch into the bag. Perhaps Whitney was reading these novels. It would give her something to do between procedures. Fiona brought the things right away. Whitney asked again if Norman would come. She felt terrible. She couldn't speak ill of Norman in front of her mother-in-law. But Fiona didn't like making up excuses anymore. Anyway, Whitney wouldn't believe her, although people tend to believe what they want to believe. And for Whitney, Norman will always be her perfect little boy. Fiona said goodbye to her mother-in-law and headed home. Norman was watching TV. She convinced him to go see his mother, albeit reluctantly. Norman left with a disgruntled look on his face, leaving Fiona alone in the apartment. The first thing she did was search for the name Matt on the internet. Nothing. There were namesakes, but either the name didn't match or the age didn't fit. What to do now? Suddenly, Fiona had an idea. Adria, that same former colleague of hers who raised a disabled child, whom she had cured. It seemed she had remarried a man who served in the police force. Perhaps she could help Fiona in some way? Adria's number was quickly found in the phone book. Adria. Hi, remember me? Hi, of course, Fiona. How are you? They chatted for a bit. It turned out Adria's son had recently won some math competition, and her daughter was attending daycare and was into dancing. Fiona felt a little sad. She genuinely rejoiced for her friend, but how she wished she could share something similar. And why does life without children feel so empty? And why doesn't Norman feel that way? Fiona briefly thought that he is like a child himself, one who needs to be pampered and protected. But she didn't complain to Adria. Adria, I'm sorry, but I need to talk business, she said apologetically. Yeah, how can I help? In a few words, Fiona explained what had happened. All right, Fiona, I'll ask my husband, promised Adria. They have some databases there, maybe he'll find something, but I won't promise. Yeah, I understand, sighed Fiona, but it's worth a try. An hour later, Adria called back. Okay, Fiona, good news. It seems we've found your guy. My husband grumbled, of course, but he agreed to help out for my sake. You owe me one, Adria said. Oh, thank you so much, I owe you one, Fiona said. Tell me what you found. So, your Matt Beecham lives in Summerhool. His wife died 5 years ago. He has a son named Sam. Write down the phone number and address. Just be careful there, privacy concerns and all. Now Fiona had the address she needed. Was it really that easy? This man was alive and well, and yet... But she had to go. It wasn't far, just a 7-hour train ride. So, all this time, Matt had been near Whitney, and she hadn't even suspected it. Life truly is a remarkable thing. Fiona called her boss, Mrs. Reedus, and asked for a week off. What's going on over there? Mrs. Reedus asked impatiently. Where am I supposed to find a replacement, Fiona? You see, I'm sick, Fiona lied, trying to make her voice sound hoarse. Sore throat and a fever. Mrs. Reedus, please understand. Imagine if the parents found out that the teacher came to work sick. There would be a scandal. Well, that's true, Mrs. Reedus conceded. Okay, we'll figure something out. Fiona hung up the phone. excellent. She had at least 3 days to find Matt and talk to him. But what if he had senile dementia like her grandmother? Fiona remembered how her grandmother would forget her granddaughter's name, sometimes calling Fiona by her daughter's name, or worse, not recognizing her at all and getting scared when Fiona approached her bed. Hopefully, Whitney's former lover still had his wits about him. Norman returned from the hospital, disgruntled. "The doctors don't understand anything," he complained. "They're saying it's unclear. Am I supposed to be a medical expert? Something about palliative care, I think." "It means they can't cure your mom, Norman. Only make her more comfortable," Fiona explained. "Fiona, can't you talk to them?" the man asked. "I can't make heads or tails of it. All these chemicals, rays, courses." "Norman, you're an adult," his wife sighed. "You talk to them." "But I don't understand any of it." He dramatically waved his hands. "The hospital smell makes me nauseous, and my head starts spinning. He talks, and all I hear is white noise." In that moment, Fiona wanted to shake her husband and snap him out of it. White noise? How delicate. But instead, she just nodded. She didn't want to argue with Norman. He'd get upset and not talk to her for days, and she couldn't stand that. She feared that after another argument, he might leave her. And what would she do then, all alone without her husband? He often joked about leaving her. In jest, of course, but still, he'd say things like, "I'm putting up with you, but I could easily find someone more compliant, wiser." As far as Fiona understood, wisdom meant a woman should never argue with her husband under any circumstances. "Well, all right, I hope you've changed your mind about going somewhere?" Norman smiled. "No, honey, I really have to. And I will," Fiona replied. "I promised." "Fiona, seriously, I didn't think you'd leave me in such a situation." The man suddenly frowned. "Norman, it's just a few days, and I'll be back. How much can I explain to you? Nothing will change. I'll make a diet soup for Whitney, and you'll deliver it," she added. "You'll be back, and then you can deliver it yourself." Norman crossed his arms. "My whole week is busy anyway. I'll be working late. When am I supposed to go to the hospital?" "Then ask for time off earlier," Fiona moaned. "Go at lunchtime. Explain the situation. Your mom is seriously ill. There must be a way to handle this, really." "I can't explain it to my boss," Norman sulked. "I thought at least my wife would understand me, but apparently I was wrong." Suddenly, Fiona felt ashamed. She couldn't even tell him why she was leaving. She didn't like lying, and she wasn't good at it. "Listen, darling, I'll be back soon," she promised. "And I'll take care of the doctors and the hospital. I'll visit your mom, I promise." In the evening, she packed her things. Norman watched his wife with an indescribable sadness in his eyes, repeatedly asking if she would definitely come back in 3 days. Fiona reassured Norman that she would definitely return. The man sighed, sadly looking at his wife, conveying with his entire demeanor how difficult it was for him to be left alone at such a challenging time, as if Fiona wasn't embarrassed enough already. But she had made a promise to Whitney, and she had no right to break it. At 5 a.m. the next day, Fiona dashed out of the house. Norman was still asleep, and she didn't want to wake him. He would start persuading her to stay again, and she really wanted to stay. Who wouldn't want to stay home in a warm bed next to their husband, especially in such dreadful cold? But Fiona believed she had to at least try to fulfill Whitney's wish. She made it to the train. It had only been at the station for 5 minutes, and Fiona was terribly afraid of being late. She boarded the train literally a minute before it departed. She caught her breath, found her seat, and sat down, wrapping herself in a long, warm scarf. Fiona watched the passing landscapes through the window and pondered. What would she even say to this Matt? Maybe he had long forgotten about Whitney, and then suddenly news about a son he had never seen in his life. He was already 75. Excitement was contraindicated. And would he believe her? And what would Norman say if his father wanted to meet him? They hardly ever talked about his dad, But when they did, Norman would repeat that he didn't want to know him. He called him a traitor, blaming his dad for abandoning his mom. And in some ways, Fiona's husband was right. Finally, the train arrived at Summerhool. Anxiously, Fiona stepped out and headed to the train station building. She had coffee there and ate a sandwich from the vending machine. Or maybe she could lie that she didn't find Matt and return home. Why was she so worried? Why were her hands shaking? She had read somewhere that such strange excitement arises before changes come into life. But hardly anything would change in her life. Why would it? Except that Norman might find another woman and leave Fiona for her. Overcoming her anxiety, the woman settled in the waiting hall and dialed the number given to her by her friend Adria. Yes, yes, a young girlish voice answered. Hello, my name is Fiona. The woman hesitated. I'd like to speak to Matt. Or Sam. Dad is at work right now, the girl said. And who are you? I'm an acquaintance of his, Fiona lied. I'm passing through the city. We went to school together. Oh, so you're a doctor too? I see, but Dad is on shift. He works at St. George's Hospital. I'll give you his number. You can contact him. Fiona wrote Sam's number on her wrist, thanking fate that her conversation partner didn't inquire further. If the girl had asked where exactly Fiona went to school with her father, she wouldn't have been able to answer. So, Sam already has an adult daughter. Judging by the voice, the girl must be a teenager. How old? 15 or 16? Then how old is Sam? He must be younger than Norman. Thanking the girl, Fiona took her things to the storage room. She would think about the hotel later. All right, St. George's Hospital? Maybe she should go there? It seemed like an excellent idea to Fiona. It would be better to talk to Matt's son, Sam, first. She found the address of the hospital. It was almost across the city. Fortunately, the bus stop was close to the station. Fiona liked the city. Small houses, resembling gingerbread ones, probably built in the early last century, wooden, decorated with Christmas garlands, leisurely passers-by. Fiona loved small towns. There was a special coziness about them. She herself dreamed of living in such a quiet place. It's a pity Norman would never agree to move. You could understand him. He values his work. She would buy an apartment in one of these houses, grow geraniums on the windowsill, get a big fluffy cat. What strange thoughts were popping into her head? Probably because of the excitement. Fiona got off at the right stop. The hospital was just a stone's throw away. A huge gray building with 8 floors. The woman was scared. How would she find Sam Beecham here? She hadn't even asked which department he worked in. Well, nothing. She'd manage. First, Fiona went to the reception desk. Fortunately, there weren't many people. There was an old lady in front of her, arguing with a tired receptionist. Fiona understood that the dialogue promised to be lengthy. She decided to look around and quickly found what she needed. There was a board on the wall listing the departments and the doctors working there. Fiona approached the board. Sam Beecham was quickly found. Only it wasn't the Sam she was looking for. His name was Samuel, not Sam. Samuel Beecham was a cardiologist and worked on the 5th floor. Well, isn't that something? So, Adria's husband was wrong? Fiona sighed. She'd come for nothing. She should have checked everything first, then bought a train ticket. It's always like this with her. She acts first, then thinks. She wanted to leave the hospital already, but stopped herself. She still had to try talking to him. In the worst-case scenario, he would decide she was crazy, and Fiona would calmly go home to her husband, Norman. By the way, how was he? Fiona dialed her husband's number. "When are you coming home?" he asked instead of greeting her. "Soon, dear," Fiona promised. "Did you go to see your mom?" "Too much work," the man replied. "Can't break away, and they won't let me go in the evening, so I'll have to wait for you. I'd love to, but..." Well, what to do with him? For the first time in her life, Fiona seriously wondered who she was living with. It had always seemed to her that she should love Norman and do everything for his sake. Just like that, by default. Because he was her husband, and Grandma always taught her so. It's your job to make sure your man is happy. Otherwise, someone else will come along who can do the job better. There aren't enough men for everyone, so sometimes you have to sacrifice your own tiredness, your own principles, your own interests. The older generation, what can you do? Women fought for good men with all their might. But why does Fiona keep doing this? She once wanted to go to university, get a higher education. The first time she couldn't because of her grandmother. The second time, Norman talked her out of it. Suddenly, you'll be all caught up in your studies, and what am I supposed to do? Cook dinner myself? Go to the store? I can't, I have work. And the woman listened to him then, although she dreamed of going to university. So what if she's not 16 anymore? You can learn at any age. Even retirees sometimes go and get a higher education. By the way, Norman talked Fiona out of going to the gym too. You'll buy a membership and won't even go. And why do you need it, Fiona? I'll feel uncomfortable. There will be all these buff guys staring at you. Of course you can go, but I'll worry. Fiona realized that all her life she had been like biting off pieces of herself and giving them away. First to her sick grandmother, but then she didn't even have a choice. Then Norman came along, and she listened to him, went along with him. Why? She didn't have an answer to that question. Maybe so he would be happy. But is Fiona happy? And does she have a choice now? What strange thoughts are popping into her head? Probably from nervousness. Her husband is good, earns money, doesn't hit her, doesn't drink. So what if he's afraid to go to the hospital to see his mother? Everyone has their own issues. You have to treat them with understanding. Fiona decisively headed towards the staircase. She needed to find this Sam and talk to him, and then go home. To Norman. Fiona went up to the 5th floor. There were 2 departments there, cardiology and gastroenterology. She headed resolutely towards the door she needed. The department was no different from where Whitney was. A long corridor, numbered rooms, and a nurse's station. A young girl in a white coat sat at the station. "Hello," Fiona smiled. "I need to see Dr. Beecham." "To see whom?" the nurse asked briskly. "Hello," Fiona repeated. "I need to see Dr. Beecham." No. Who did you come to visit? What's the last name? Who does Dr. Beecham treat?" "No, you don't understand. I need to see Dr. Beecham himself. I don't have anyone here," Fiona confessed. "Oh, I see. And for what reason?" The girl frowned. "Are you here to argue or file a complaint?" No, not to argue or complain." Fiona clasped her hands and pleaded with the nurse. "You see, it's personal. Very important." "Well, you understand that I can't just let you through like that." The nurse's expression grew even stricter. "I'll let you in now, and then I'll get in trouble. Do you know how many incidents we've had? Just recently, a relative came to the trauma ward and got into a fight with a doctor because they thought his brother wasn't being treated well, and the brother fell off a balcony, drunk, right onto his head. How do you treat that? They saved him, and that's good. But he thought his brother was taking too long to come around, you see?" "I understand," Fiona sighed. "I won't cause any trouble, believe me." The nurse shrugged. "Fine, just please understand, ma'am." "I really need to." Fiona lowered her gaze. "It's a family matter." "Well, you don't seem like the type to cause a scene." The nurse suddenly lowered her voice. "Just so you know, I didn't tell you anything. Go to the doctor's office. He's in there now. You'll recognize him right away. He's tall, very thin. Go." "Thank you so much." Fiona beamed. "Thank you." She should have bought something in advance to give to the nurse who agreed to let her through. Fiona always forgets something. Norman often talks about it. Sometimes she forgets to buy bread. Sometimes she doesn't pay the utility bills on time. Sometimes she forgets to iron his shirt. She felt ashamed of her recent thoughts about Norman. She herself is nothing but a constant flaw, and yet she dares to reproach him for something. First, she needs to become a good wife, and then demand something from a man. She knocked on the door of the doctor's office and pushed it open. Indeed, she recognized Sam right away. Tall, very thin, with a refined face as if he had stepped out of an 18th century English aristocrat's portrait, and his expressive brown eyes, which Fiona couldn't help but stare at. "How can I help you?" Sam smiled, tearing himself away from some papers. "Hello, I have a question," Fiona faltered. And why didn't she think about what she would say beforehand? "Please, have a seat." Sam nodded towards the couch. "Who are you here for treatment?" Fiona obediently sat down. "Right, let's get to the point." "Nobody is being treated. I mean, they were treated, but not by you. Actually, I'm here about something else," Fiona began. His eyebrows shot up. "Okay, and what would that be?" "Could you please tell me if you're familiar with Matt Beecham?" Fiona asked. Sam nodded thoughtfully. "Well, yes, I know him. What exactly are you interested in?" "The thing is, I have some relation to him. My husband, he's, well, his son. But maybe it's just a coincidence." "All right, let's start over." Sam smiled. "It'll be easier and clearer that way." Fiona nodded. What a calm, deep voice he had. Patients probably adore him. She began to speak, telling him about her mother-in-law, the meeting with Matt, and her illness. The man listened and nodded. There was no emotion on his face, as if what Fiona was saying didn't concern him at all. "Looks like I was mistaken," Fiona concluded her story. "I'm 6 years older than your husband," Sam said thoughtfully. "But I don't think you were mistaken. Do you have a picture of this Matt?" Fiona nodded, took out a photo from her bag and handed it to Sam. "Yes, here he is." Dr. Beecham took the picture and held it up to his eyes. "Yes, that's him, would you believe it? I had no idea he had children. It's unbelievable." "So I wasn't wrong?" Fiona asked. "No, you weren't wrong, it seems." Sam returned Fiona the photograph and leaned back in his chair. "But I'm not sure if it'll be possible to take him to your mother-in-law. He's been sick for a long time and it's serious. He has diabetes. It's complicated. He hardly leaves the house. My mom passed away last year, and now his dad is seriously ill. It often happens like this. One spouse leaves, and the other doesn't see a reason to live anymore, you know? I see this kind of thing all the time. But anyway, that's not the point now. Oh, by the way, you haven't introduced yourself." "Fiona, I'm sorry, I didn't think." "That's okay, you're probably nervous. All right, I suggest we meet tomorrow, discuss everything. In the afternoon, say around 6? Sam pondered. "Well, that works for me," Fiona said. "I'll stay in the hotel. We can talk there, if it's convenient for you, of course." What is she doing? Inviting a stranger man to her room? What would Norman think? Although Sam has a wedding ring on his finger. "So, which hotel are you staying at?" "Well, I'm not staying at any hotel yet," Fiona admitted. "I arrived in the morning and came straight to you." "All right, then I recommend Mason Road. It's just around the corner. I'll explain how to get there. The prices are low, and the conditions are quite good. Almost all our relatives stay there. Tell them I sent you. They'll give you a discount. I treated the director of that hotel once." "Okay, thank you," Fiona nodded. "Well, that's great. I'll come by around 6, and we'll talk there." Sam smiled again. His smile was wonderful. Bright and kind. A true doctor. Probably, with just one smile, he can calm down and uplift a patient. But he looked tired and sad somehow. There was something in his gaze, like a flicker of light that was about to fade away. It hadn't disappeared completely yet, but it was on the verge of extinguishing forever. And Fiona was surprised by her own thoughts. What smile? What flicker? Perhaps she was going crazy. After saying goodbye to Sam, Fiona went in search of the hotel. She found it easily. A charming two-story building with a bright sign and small balconies on the second floor. Indeed, the hotel looked very cozy. Fiona checked into room 10 without mentioning that Sam had referred her. She felt awkward asking for a discount. Besides, the price was quite reasonable. The room she got was small, single-bedded, but it had everything she needed. A comfortable bed, a kettle, a table, and even a small TV. She called the hospital where Whitney was admitted. Her condition remained unchanged, undergoing examinations. Then she tried calling her husband. Norman didn't answer. Well, he must be at work. If he wants to, he'll call her back himself. Fiona rested for a bit. Then she took a stroll around the city. She rarely goes out anywhere. With Norman, they only went on vacation together a couple of times. He preferred spending vacations at home, and he often goes on business trips and gets tired there, and it's not right to go alone without her husband. She wanted to go alone once, but Norman got very offended and didn't even speak to her for a couple of days. Somehow, he decided that Fiona's main goal wasn't to relax, but to meet other men who would surely engage in indecencies with her. Fiona liked the town of Summerhool. It was a quiet province, probably great for raising children. She saw many mothers with strollers on the streets and felt a bit envious. They seemed so proud, filled with a sense of self-worth, happy. But Fiona still had time. Maybe she would stroll down the street with a stroller someday, with her little one peacefully napping inside. Perhaps Norman just wasn't ready yet. She had to wait. The main thing was not to wait too long. Fiona had some coffee, bought souvenirs, then returned to the hotel. She wanted to watch TV but fell asleep as soon as her head touched the pillow. The next day, she felt restless for some reason. She paced around the room, tried to watch TV, went for a walk, but immediately came back. What if Sam arrived early? She couldn't understand why she was so nervous, whether it was because she was about to find out the truth or because of the upcoming meeting with this man. There was something about him that she terribly liked. Perhaps his calmness, or the warmth in his brown eyes. She tried not to think about his eyes. After all, she was a married woman, and Sam, in a way, was her husband's brother. Maybe Norman was right about something. Whenever she goes somewhere alone, strange thoughts start creeping into her mind. Sam finally arrived, exactly at 6 o'clock, as promised. They settled on the bed. Fiona made tea and even bought cookies. After all, conversations usually flow better over tea. Well, what can I say? You're right, Sam began. Your husband's father is Matt, my stepfather, a wonderful man. I've always been genuinely attached to him. I was terribly surprised to find out he had a child he hadn't been taking care of. He didn't know about Norman, and Whitney, who had a child with Matt, didn't tell him. She was too upset back then. Fiona sighed. Yes, maybe if he had known, everything would have turned out completely differently. Sam looked sadly somewhere past Fiona. God, how strange. Sometimes, so much fate depends on someone's decision. Can you tell me about how he lived? What kind of person he was? Whitney would like to know why it turned out this way. They seemed to love each other very much, according to her, Fiona said. Well, you see, I was little when he appeared, Sam shrugged. I was only 6 years old at the time. Sam began his story. Until he was 6, he lived with his mother, Teresa. She worked as a therapist. She struggled to make ends meet. Sam remembered his mother as constantly tired, irritable, and shouty. Now, he understood that the irritability was connected to her constant, unending fatigue. Mornings were spent rushing around the hospital, and evenings were filled with patient consultations. And it was like that every day. On weekends, Teresa either spent time with her chronically ill mother or in the country house with a garden. Sam's mother once had a husband, but she left him when Sam turned 2. Sam's biological father drank. That was something one could get used to. Who doesn't drink after all? But over time, he started drinking more often and then developed a habit of hitting his wife. Fortunately, Teresa didn't tolerate this. She kicked her husband out, telling him to go back to his hometown to his parents. Although he came back a few times to try and reconcile, He tried to rebuild the relationship, pounding on doors, shouting throughout the building, demanding Teresa to let him back in, and Teresa had to call the police. Her ex-husband was taken to the station, after which he calmed down for a while and left his wife and son alone. But soon, it all repeated itself again. And so it went on until Teresa's husband, in another drunken episode, got hit by a car. For some reason, he decided to cross the road at that moment. Teresa had to bury him herself. She cried a little, even blamed herself for her ex-husband's death, but gradually, she calmed down. Sam, on the other hand, didn't mourn his father at all. He didn't love him. Rather, he was afraid of him. Now, with just his mother and him, Sam no longer feared the sound of the opening door. He remembered this feeling forever. The turn of the key in the lock was a signal of alarm for him. What kind of dad would it be today? Drunk or sober? Would there be a scandal or a quiet family evening? Would Mom cry again? Growing up, Sam promised himself that he would never touch a drop of alcohol. And he kept his word. Even when he was in medical school, he never drank at student parties. Although his classmates laughed at him and demanded that he join the fun, no, his children would never fear the sound of the opening door. They would always know that their dad was sober and wouldn't fall asleep on the kitchen floor, snoring loudly throughout the apartment. And they would never experience the disgusting stale smell of alcohol. Since money was tight, Teresa decided to rent out one of the rooms in their 2-bedroom apartment. It was a way to earn more. One of their lodgers was Matt. Matt immediately appealed to Sam. He was a kind, intelligent, child-loving man. He spent a long time chatting with the boy after work, telling him about ancient Egypt, dinosaurs, distant space, and talking to him about sports. Sam even thought, "Oh, if only Matt were his father. It must be great to have such a dad." And in class, where the boy studied, everyone had fathers. Sam was raised by a single mother, and he was tired of catching sympathetic looks from teachers and answering questions from classmates who were terribly curious about where his father had gone. Sam lied, saying that his dad worked in another city and came to visit them very rarely. The boy knew that no one believed him, but he didn't want to say that his dad drank a lot and his mom kicked him out of the house. It was shameful. He felt ashamed of such a father, as if he was somehow responsible for his behavior. Matt's business trip ended, and he left, but he returned 3 days later. Mom said he would stay with them forever. Sam didn't really know how it happened, maybe thanks to his sincere childhood prayers, but now he had a dad to be proud of. Smart, kind, sober, and caring. Matt taught him how to fish, build airplane models, and fly kites. He was a wonderful father. Perfect. 8 months after his return, Sam's younger sister Molly was born. They were almost the perfect family. Sam was happy. He loved both his sister and stepfather. And he also liked that Mom started working less. She looked younger, her eyes sparkled, she became more beautiful, she became kinder. Time passed. Molly grew up. Sam finished school and went to medical school. He passed his exams easily and got in through competition, despite the lack of connections and money. After completing the 3rd year, he returned to his hometown for summer break as usual. Matt wasn't there. At first, Teresa didn't tell her son what happened, but then she confessed that he cheated on her. "With some disgusting girl," Mom grimaced in disgust. "I kicked him out. Molly doesn't know. Don't tell her. I told her he's on a business trip." "Mom, how could this happen?" Sam was surprised. "Everything was fine with you guys." "It was, yes. But some men can't keep it in their pants for long. It's okay, son. We'll get through this." Then Matt and Teresa reconciled again. Sam was glad, but he still couldn't forgive his stepfather completely. He cheated on her several more times, but always came back to Teresa. Maybe he really loved her. And she? She adored him. Sam graduated from college, returned to his hometown and got a job. Get married. Life went on as always, only there was a problem with Molly. At 15, she managed to get pregnant by a classmate. Sam didn't like to remember that moment. His mother became ill from worry. Her stepfather walked around gloomily and threatened Molly with every possible and impossible punishment. It was impossible to abort. Molly waited too long, and she didn't tell her parents about her pregnancy. Summerhool is a small town. There is nothing to hide. "Well, what should we do now?" Matt lamented. However, Sam managed to come up with a solution. He was already living with his wife, Helen, a young graduate student at the local university. "Let her give birth, and Helen and I will take the baby," Sam said. "Wait, what? How?" his stepfather exclaimed. "Well, send her somewhere. Let her carry the pregnancy to term, give birth. We'll adopt the baby," Sam declared. "I'll convince Helen." Convincing his wife was not easy. She adamantly refused to raise someone else's child. But somehow, Sam succeeded. "Well, let's say she's the daughter of my distant relative who died during childbirth," he told his wife. "Helen, I can't send my own niece to an orphanage, understand?" Helen was angry for a long time, but eventually agreed. However, she said she wouldn't take care of the child. "I already have a lot on my plate, Sam, but I was missing a baby. So, you and your mom take care of her since Molly doesn't want the child. The baby isn't wanted by her biological mom, and I certainly don't need it," she said. So, Sam had to agree to his wife's conditions. Molly gave birth to a girl named Tiffany. Sam's plan worked, and he took Tiffany in. Helen hardly approached her, leaving all the care to Sam. For the first 3 years of Tiffany's life, he hardly slept. The girl was restless, cried a lot, and was often temperamental. But Sam loved his niece with all his heart, and Tiffany responded in kind. And that's how Sam became a father at the age of 23. He had always loved children and wanted to have 2 or even 3 of his own. Before marrying Helen, she promised that they would definitely have children. Just a little later. First, they needed to finish graduate school, buy a house and a car, get on their feet. But seeing how difficult it was for Sam with Tiffany, his wife suddenly changed her mind. "Sam, it's all about cries and diapers again. And, honestly, I'm scared to give birth. I care about my figure, and your sister Molly gained weight after giving birth to Tiffany." "I don't want that, darling," Helen lamented. Molly did indeed gain weight. She returned to Summerhool a month after Tiffany was born. They had to lie to all relatives and friends, saying that Molly fell seriously ill and had to take hormones, hence the weight gain. When Tiffany turned 5, her mother, Molly, left for Australia. She met a local resident through correspondence and married him. She forgot about her daughter. However, Sam wasn't particularly bothered by it. Everyone makes their own choices. Molly is happy. He is happy too, so it must be fine. "She's living somewhere in Australia," sighed Sam. "I miss my sister. She rarely calls. She already has 3 children there. Probably her husband doesn't even know about Tiffany." "So, was I the one talking to Tiffany on the phone?" Fiona guessed. "She told me where to find you." "Yeah, probably," nodded Sam. "Helen is always at work, and Tiffany works from home as a designer, drawing and selling stuff. She's a very talented girl." Pride resonated in Sam's words. Fiona understood. He truly adores his niece. It's almost like he's following in his stepfather's footsteps. Matt also raised someone else's child and, apparently, raised him to be a good person. A thought crossed Fiona's mind. It's a pity that Sam is married. The thought appeared and disappeared immediately, leaving a bitter aftertaste. Norman definitely wouldn't have taken such a step. Children disrupt comfort, don't let you live for yourself, demand everything you have, and even more. And Norman isn't up for that. But Sam managed. "Well, I don't have much more to tell," he smiled. "For some reason, Matt chose my mom, and I don't know why. We could try to ask, but I think it's best not to reopen old wounds." "Yeah, I don't know either," Fiona admitted. "But my mother-in-law, she doesn't have much time left, and I'd like to fulfill her wish. She remembered him her whole life." "Well, it's not surprising." Sam thoughtfully stroked his chin. "He made a mistake, but he's a wonderful person nonetheless. Not every man can love someone else's child like that. Yes, he cheated on Mom." I don't know what to make of it, but she forgave him. They had such a great love, so what now? For some, physical infidelity is like going to the gym. Fiona sighed. There are feelings, and there's sexual desire. It's like they're different things. Well, I don't personally think so, Sam admitted. If you love a woman, you won't want anyone else. That's obvious. Though you're right in some ways, everyone is different. They fell silent for a moment. Fiona secretly studied his face. He was so handsome, a special kind of beauty, otherworldly, almost too delicate. Listen, I can introduce you to him and Tiffany. The man broke the silence. Tiffany takes care of him. She works from home, so they decided that. And I help out whenever I can, of course. Oh, I'd love to meet him, Fiona replied. And Tiffany, too. Sam smiled at her, and Fiona's heart skipped a beat. She's a lovely girl. She'll like you, Sam said. Does she know? Yes, she does, the man replied. I didn't see the point in hiding it. I thought it better for me to tell her than someone else. I told her everything when she was 10. I figured she was old enough to understand. And she did. She did ask about her mother, of course. But Molly wasn't too keen on communicating with Tiffany. She has her own life over there in Australia. What can you do? I understand that for Tiffany. Molly's like a youthful mistake. Nobody wants anything to remind them of their mistakes, don't you agree? Oh, sorry. I've gone and babbled on completely. You're probably not interested in my personal life. No, not at all. You're interesting, Fiona honestly replied. I think you're quite fascinating. And she felt herself blush. What was happening to her? What would her husband Norman think of this? By the way, how was he doing without Fiona? Not every woman would go look for her mother-in-law's ex, Sam said. My wife, for instance, immediately said she wouldn't communicate with my mother. Only on holidays. But Helen really had a lot of work, and she's not the most sentimental person in the world, Sam coughed. Oh, sorry again. I've gone and chattered away. Lord knows what about. Apparently, you have a very inviting appearance. Yes, I'm often told that, Fiona laughed. I work with children. I'm a kindergarten teacher, so that probably shows somehow. Oh, children, they're wonderful. Sam warmly smiled. I envy you a bit, actually. The time when Tiffany was little was probably the best in my life. All those endless questions, curiosity, funny little words. If only he were my husband. This thought suddenly pierced Fiona to the core. She didn't need Norman. She needed a man like Sam. That's why she admires him, feels a connection. With him, she would have the children she dreams of. She would wait for him to come home from work. He would come home tired, but after his shift, he would immediately go to the children to kiss them, to find out how they were, what they did while Daddy was at work. Fiona shook her head. It seems like she's losing her mind after all. She has a husband, Norman, and that's it. So, maybe you'd like to come over to our place now? Sam suggested. Just that Matt, he's really not doing well since Mom passed away. What happened to her? She had a stroke, Sam sighed. Paralyzed. Couldn't move a hand or a foot. I tried everything. Got rare medicines, consulted with colleagues who are considered the best neurologists. It seemed like she was improving. She even started walking again, and her speech was almost back to normal. And then, bam, a second stroke, and a week later, Mom was gone. Yeah, that happens. Sometimes I start to believe you can't escape fate, Fiona said, feeling really sad now. Sam took care of his mother, trying to save her. He wouldn't shift the responsibility onto his wife. Though, perhaps Fiona is to blame herself. They say that a man can act differently with different women. Had she been wiser, Norman too might not have strayed from his mother. Who knows? But then, how does one become wiser? And what is Fiona doing wrong? Sam, I'm ready to go with you right now, and sorry if I'm bothering you, she said. Fiona, you're not bothering me at all. He stood up. adjusting his long gray sweater that suited him well. "I'm happy to help, especially since it's about my stepfather's son. I think Matt has the right to know. Plus, he lives nearby. Actually, we could take a walk. The weather is nice." Fiona looked at Sam, surprised. He suggested a walk. Was it out of politeness, or did she appeal to him for some reason? And perhaps he felt the same way about her. "I would enjoy a walk," she admitted. "You know, I've grown fond of your town." "Me too." Sam smiled. "Helen doesn't like it much. She wants to move to a big city. She's very active. But I really don't want to leave here, you know. It's so quiet, mainly cozy. It's warm in winter. I lived in a big city during my studies, and I didn't like it. The city is all hustle and bustle, everyone always running somewhere. Life spent on the move." Fiona suddenly remembered Whitney's story, how she, after meeting Matt, observed him and understood every word, every gesture she liked, and matched her ideal. Now, Fiona felt something similar, what Whitney must have felt then, but it was happening at such an inconvenient time. They left the hotel. Fiona admired the town. The silence was only occasionally broken by passing cars. The snow shimmered in the warm yellow light of the street lamps. Windows in the houses were lit. Fiona always liked to look at other people's windows and wonder about the lives behind those curtains. Someone watering geraniums and violets. Someone petting a cat sitting on the windowsill. Do the apartment's inhabitants argue? Or do they live soul in soul? And yet, if she told someone about her thoughts, they might think she's crazy. What kind of folly is it to look at other people's windows? Sam would understand her. Fiona was somehow sure of it, but that only made her sadder. She would soon leave and never see him again. And what then to do with this annoying inner voice insisting he's the one? Her person. They didn't just meet earlier by chance. It was as random as Matt's meeting with Whitney, when his future other half lived just a couple of 100 kilometers away from her. "By the way, what about your mother-in-law?" Sam asked, pulling Fiona from her silly, strange thoughts. "She has stomach cancer, unfortunately, and the doctor said yesterday it's too late to do anything." "I can look at the documents and tests," Sam offered. "I have a good friend who is an oncologist. Maybe he can suggest something." "Oh, thank you so much." Fiona sincerely thanked him. "Thank you, Sam." They walked and talked about the little things. The man recommended she take a ride on the local tram, which passed by all the landmarks of Summerhool. He shared stories about his favorite cafe, where they make the world's most delicious pastries, and where he used to go with his mom after school whenever he got good grades, of course. Fiona listened to him, wishing the journey could last forever. When had she and Norman ever talked like this? It had been a long time, a very long time. Probably only until their wedding. Then came work. Then the routine. There was no time left for conversations. Fiona thought this was how it was supposed to be. Marriage wasn't about romance. It wasn't about moonlit walks and declarations of love. It was work for both spouses. Only it seemed, in her family, she was the only one doing the work. What a time she'd chosen to reflect on her life. Indeed. They arrived at the house and went up to the second floor. Sam rang the doorbell. The door swung open, and Fiona saw a girl of about 18, 20 years old, not very tall, with brown eyes and curly hair. "Hi, Dad," she hugged her father. "Grandpa's just fine. Ate well, now he's watching TV." Sam tenderly hugged his daughter. "Hi, this is my friend Fiona. She's here on a very important matter. I'll fill you in shortly." Tiffany smiled at Fiona. "Hi, I'll make some tea. It's so cold outside." Fiona felt ashamed that she had recently lied to Tiffany, claiming she had studied with her father. Such a nice girl. Always smiling, yet she lives with a sick person. Fiona knew what that was like. In the kitchen, Sam explained to his daughter why Fiona had come to Summerhowl. The woman appreciated that he didn't lie, that he was honest with Tiffany. It seemed, in this family, they only spoke the truth. "Wow, Really? You came all the way here? Oh, cool. Tiffany, remember we agreed. Speak properly, Sam chided gently. Sorry, Dad. It's just surprising that you came, Tiffany giggled. So, Dad, turns out you have a brother, right? Well, not exactly a brother, Sam shrugged. I don't know what to call this kind of familial relationship. How about a distant cousin? Let's say that, Tiffany suggested. But how do we tell Grandpa? He's been grumpy today, refused even to have tea with me. Sits alone in his room. It's the age. Don't be upset with him. Sam stroked her head. She squinted like a kitten. Maybe I should try to explain it to him, Fiona suggested. Let's all go together, sighed Sam. You don't know him at all. He's become more peculiar with age. Right. The day before yesterday, he actually threw a newspaper at Dad because he didn't like something in the news, Tiffany chuckled. So, stay on your toes. And Fiona shivered. Probably this whole idea was hopeless from the start, but since she had come, there was no turning back. The three of them went into the living room where Matt was watching TV, lying on the couch. Dad, I'd like you to meet someone, Sam said gently, sitting down next to him. Who? The old man asked. What's happened now? This is Fiona. She wanted to tell you something, and don't worry too much. I'm here, and Tiffany is too, Sam said, taking Matt's dry, wrinkled hand. Fiona, come over here. The guest sat next to Sam. His proximity seemed to give her strength, and she told him everything she had planned to tell about Whitney, about Norman, about how she had remembered him all her life, but pride had prevented Whitney from speaking to Matt. Whitney, the man whispered. So, she remembered, and I have a son. Is he good, kind? Yes, Fiona said, feeling she was stretching the truth a bit. He's very good. Do you love him? Matt smiled, but his eyes gleamed as if he was about to cry. Fiona hesitated a bit. Of course, I love him. How could I not? So why didn't he come himself? You see, Whitney didn't want Norman to know, at least not yet. We didn't know where you were. The old man turned to Sam. Son, I want to see her. Help me, please. Dad, it's risky. Maybe we could call her on video? Fiona can help us. No, I need to see her. Matt frowned. In person, not through your gadgets. I need to say that I'm sorry. If I had known about the son, I would have... Sam looked at Fiona. We'll figure something out, Dad. Okay? Yes, Fiona supported him. We'll definitely come up with something, Matt, I promise. And they went back to the kitchen again, leaving Tiffany with Grandpa, worried he might take ill. I have a suggestion. Dad is, in principle, able to travel. We could make it. I'll accompany him, Sam offered. I'll bring his medication. Everything he needs, I'll have it with me. I know how. We'll get him to Whitney. Let the old folks meet. I couldn't ask you to do that, Fiona said. I can figure something out on my own. There must be some organizations that transport sick people. There are, but it's very expensive. And I'd feel more at ease if I personally went. Sam placed his hand on hers, and Fiona flinched as if struck by an electric shock. Don't worry, Fiona. It won't be hard for me to help. I want to do something nice for my father. When are you planning to return? My return ticket is for the day after tomorrow. Yes, the day after tomorrow, she replied, not moving her hand away. Then let's do this. We'll go together. Okay? What about your wife? Fiona asked, worried. It'll be fine. The man darkened and withdrew his hand. Fiona, I'll manage to talk to her. Don't worry about it. But it might be inconvenient. I don't want to cause any conflicts. That's my concern. Sam looked away. So, we'll leave the day after tomorrow. I'll call you. Leave me your number, and let me walk you back to your hotel after all. Fiona hesitated, but Sam insisted. They walked together again, and the woman felt simultaneously infinitely happy and terribly unhappy. How could this be? She barely knew him. Why was she so afraid they were about to part? It shouldn't be like this. Love at first sight is a fairy tale for children. And she was a married woman, 35 years old. It wasn't right to fall for a stranger. Yet she knew that Sam was no stranger. Sam was the man she could love for the rest of her life. And Fiona knew he would love her too. It was a pity it was not meant to be. Such was fate. In front of the hotel, he suddenly stopped. "Is something wrong?" Fiona asked her companion. "No, nothing." The man shook his head. "It's just all so unexpected for me." "Yeah, my visit was unexpected." And she guiltily looked into his eyes, smiling slightly. "But I'm very grateful you didn't send me away, Sam." "Probably because I like unexpected things," he tilted his head. "So don't worry, Fiona. Goodbye." He extended his hand to her. She grasped it, feeling her heart sink. The man suddenly turned and walked down the street, lit by lamps, and Fiona listened to the crunch of snow under his feet, feeling an overwhelming urge to cry. Back in her room, she called her husband. "What's taking so long? I have nothing to eat here. Can't your friend do without you?" "Well, I can. Good job, Fiona." "She can't, not yet. I'll be back the day after tomorrow, in the evening," she replied. "But you said it would be sooner." Norman sighed. "Fiona, I don't like this." "Sorry, dear, I need to sleep," she interrupted. "Good night." The next day, she spent wandering the city. She enjoyed this odd escape from her usual life, even if just for a few days. Why did Fiona dread returning so much? She loved her husband, she thought, or convinced herself she did. Sam kept his promise. Together with him and Matt, Fiona was heading home. She had hoped Norman would meet them at the station, but he said he couldn't. Work. Fiona bitterly thought that work always had been and always would be Norman's priority. Is it like that for everyone? Or does she long for something she doesn't deserve? If only she were beautiful or talented, or like Sam's wife, smart, business savvy, and capable. But Fiona felt she was none of those things. Sam and his father checked into a hotel. Fiona went home, regretting that their little adventure had come to an end. She had enjoyed every moment with Sam. He joked, shared funny stories from his medical practice, and even confessed he wanted to write a book about his colleagues and patients. "You hear and see so much when you're a doctor. It's just incredible," he said. "You could write an entire catalog of human characters. People are so different and yet so similar." "Similar in what way?" Fiona asked. "They all want the same thing, I guess," Sam replied. "I think everyone just wants to be loved." At home, Fiona found the place in utter disarray. Norman had a strong aversion to tidying up, leaving socks scattered everywhere and cups with unfinished tea lying around. After taking a shower, Fiona started cleaning, hoping it would distract her from thoughts of Sam. She even managed to visit Whitney to ensure the woman was doing all right. Whitney inquired if they had managed to find Matt. "Yes, Whitney, we found him," the woman smiled. "Maybe you'll get to meet him. He hasn't forgotten about you, by the way." That evening, Fiona wanted to share everything with Norman, but couldn't bring herself to do it. Her husband grumbled about being left alone for so long, and then declared he wouldn't allow it to happen again. "Did I marry for nothing?" he asked, glaring at Fiona. "You know, it's hard to work and also handle all this domestic stuff." Suddenly, Fiona realized his words no longer affected her. In the past, she would have started to defend herself. But now, something had changed. What exactly, though? "Come to the hospital tomorrow evening. I'll be going too," she told Norman. "Fiona, I can't. Why can't you understand? Where's this demanding attitude coming from?" the husband protested. "Do this. Do that. I'm working, and I'll tell you again, I am working. It's important for you to come. It's very important." She shrugged. "I mean, you don't have to, of course, Norman, but it would be in your best interest." What kind of secrets are these? Norman looked at his wife suspiciously. Listen, I don't like this. You've been acting strangely lately. It will all be over soon, Fiona promised. But please, come to the hospital tomorrow. It's very important. Norman nodded. All right, since you insist. Just don't ask later why we're short on money. I'm not asking, she replied calmly. Tomorrow, Norman, by 5 o'clock in the evening. Please don't be late. Norman didn't show up for the meeting, calling 10 minutes beforehand to say he was held up at work. Fiona found herself indifferent to his absence. Sam wheeled Matt into Whitney's room in a wheelchair. Fiona was already there, holding Whitney's hand, terrified that the mother-in-law would become too agitated and fall ill, or start crying, or berate Matt and cause a scene. Anything could happen. But what happened was completely unexpected. Both Matt and Whitney remained silent. They looked at each other without saying a word, then held hands. Let's go. Sam touched Fiona's shoulder. Let's leave them for now. Really? She asked in a barely audible voice. Yes, really. The man smiled. I think my dad has a lot to say, and they don't need witnesses. They walked out into the hospital corridor and approached a window. Wow, Sam sighed. Such things happen. It's mind-blowing. It's strange. They haven't seen each other for so long. I thought there would be a scandal. Fiona said thoughtfully, looking out the window. But they just sit in silence and look at each other. Did you see the way they looked? Sam smiled. I think my father always loved her, but not my mom so much. You know, children can feel that. I don't understand why he stayed. Must have been scary. Just like that, the man faltered. Fiona shifted her gaze to Sam. He looked wistfully into the distance, through the trees, the houses, as if through time and space itself. What did you mean when you said it was scary? Well, to love someone and then to part ways. I think he wanted to come back, but he had already given my mother hope. Decided it would all work out somehow, I guess. He didn't know about your husband. I mean, about Whitney's son. Maybe things would have been different? Because you have to speak up. You can't hide something like that, Fiona stated firmly. Yes, maybe. But it's not always possible, Sam replied evasively. Sometimes circumstances are stronger. What kind of circumstances are stronger than love? I don't understand, Fiona exclaimed. And then she immediately blushed. What a naive and pompous thing to say. That's the kind of dialogue you'd expect from characters in cheap daytime soaps and paperback romances, not from grown adults. You know, things happen, Sam shrugged. Shall we go back to them? See what's happening? When they entered the room, Matt and Whitney were talking quietly. Whitney smiled peacefully. Her face seemed to glow with an ethereal, serene light. It turns out she had forgiven him. Standing at death's door, one can probably forgive anyone for anything. Half an hour later, Sam took his father back to the hotel. The next day, he was due to go home. Fiona stayed with Whitney. Thank you, dear. Thank you so much, the elderly woman said softly. It's nothing, Fiona smiled. Did you expect it to turn out this way? Had you planned for it? I didn't plan anything. The mother-in-law shifted to get more comfortable on her pillow. Her smile never left her face. I always remembered him, yet I never understood why things turned out the way they did. And now? Do you understand? Now? Still no clue. Whitney's smile broadened. What can I do? That's how things turned out. I made a mistake when I let him go. Made many mistakes, actually. With my son, too. With Norman? Fiona was surprised. Yes, Whitney replied calmly. I spoiled him. Did everything for him. You think I don't see what kind of person he is? I love him. But I understand. He doesn't even visit me. Probably doesn't want to. You know, he's really busy at work, Fiona said. It's a total mess over there. Suddenly, Whitney covered Fiona's hand with her own. Fiona, I understand. I'm not foolish. Maybe I was once, but not now. And you're a good girl. Fiona didn't know what to say. She felt sorry for her mother-in-law to the point of tears, but she didn't know how to help, except maybe convincing Norman to visit his mom at least occasionally. Just remember, dear, never let pride dictate your actions. Never. Whitney gently squeezed her hand. Do what your heart tells you, always. They'll say it's wrong, but don't listen to anyone. Okay, I understand, Fiona whispered. I'll remember your advice. She returned home, tidied up, and cooked dinner as usual, but there was a strange emptiness in Fiona's heart. Norman came back, asked how the meeting went. Fine, his wife replied. I think I did everything right. Well, maybe you shouldn't have bothered with the old folks. Going somewhere. Norman frowned. She got some crazy idea. You speak as if you have no heart at all, Fiona burst out. Oh, and you're the one with a huge heart. Norman shook his head. Start indulging her, and she'll start taking advantage of you. Then you'll thank me yourself, Fiona. Norman, she's dying, Fiona frowned. Don't you understand? One needs to be realistic, Fiona. Everyone dies, Norman declared. And my biological dad, too. He abandoned us, and you arranged this meeting for him. Why? Fiona didn't reply to him, but that night, she slept on the couch in the kitchen. She suddenly realized she would never share a bed with her husband again. Divorce would have to be arranged, and whatever would be, would be. The next day, Sam left. Fiona went to see him off at the station after work. For some reason, when the train departed, tears rolled down her cheeks. And just 3 days later, Sam called her. Fiona, I came to your town for a short while, barely managed to escape. I'm at the Quiet Harbor Hotel. I understand, she replied. I'll come. He didn't need to explain anything. She already knew why he had come. She knew and couldn't help but go to him. The Quiet Harbor turned out to be a very pleasant place. A small, cozy hotel in the center of their town, surrounded by trees. For some reason, Sam's room smelled of sea breeze, cinnamon, and sweet pastries. He was waiting for her. Both understood why, understood without words, just like Whitney and Matt once did. I couldn't not come, he whispered, embracing her. I know, the woman replied, burying her face in his shoulder. That evening, nothing extraordinary happened. They simply sat together, embracing and talking. Fiona understood there was a line they couldn't cross, as they both had spouses and both preferred to abide by the rules. But still, there was something elemental about it, feelings that couldn't be ignored. Or perhaps there was no desire from either of them to simply cope with them. I'll definitely come again, Sam promised, walking her home. What do we do next? Fiona asked. I don't know yet, he shrugged helplessly. But I feel like staying with you. And since you came, you want to too, right? The woman nodded, smiling sadly. You know, I've realized a lot lately about you and about what I considered my family. I never told you about my wife. He took her hand. I've been thinking about divorce for a long time, suggesting it to her, but she doesn't want to. I'm needed for her image, you know. What? The woman was taken aback. For her image? Yes, for her image, he smirked. Husband, doctor, perfect family. It earns more sympathy from potential voters, you see? She's planning to go into politics. So, divorce for her would be a blow. That's why it's not an option. A blow to her image, understand? And you? The woman asked. So what about me? I thought I could live like this. A formal marriage, no intimacy. For many years already. You want to ask if I've had someone? Once. Couldn't resist after all those years of abstinence. Nothing serious. Just once. And after that time, I felt terrible, I must admit. I promised myself I wouldn't do it again. And then you came, and it was like being struck by lightning. Like you were my person. Fiona giggled like a schoolgirl. Sam looked at her in surprise. What's so funny? Nothing, it was just beautifully said. Sorry, he smiled. It's hard to put it any other way. She never mustered the courage to kiss him goodbye. Later, they'll have time for that later. Sam left, and Fiona began to wait. Wait for his calls, messages, wait for him to finally say that he's divorcing his wife. She worked, went to the hospital, cooked, cleaned, but she felt like her life had changed forever. Norman, it seemed, paid no attention to the changes in her mood. He calmly went to work, refused to visit his mother, and only once suggested that Fiona should see a psychologist. Listen, you've become strange, distant, her husband remarked. Maybe something's wrong with your head? Go, get yourself checked. Okay, dear, I definitely will, Fiona smiled. I'll go. Sam came 2 more times. He said he talked to Helen. She didn't want a divorce. She suggested they have an affair on the side, but discreetly. That was a compromise for her, but Sam didn't agree with such an arrangement. I'm afraid I'll have to divorce her through the court, he sighed. I offered her everything I have. She doesn't want it. You know, it feels like I'm just an accessory to a successful woman. At least, that's how she sees me. Oh, you, Fiona teased. Why are you so sophisticated? What do you mean? He looked surprised. Can't you just slam your fist on the table and leave? Well, I was raised differently. Fiona, I'll do everything. We'll be together. Will you take me? Of course I will, Sam. By the way, Tiffany, she likes you too. I told her everything. She's mature enough. She, let's say, roots for you. She never got along with Helen. Helen used to scold her even in childhood, saying she was in her way. She told her nasty things about her mother. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. It's all unnecessary. Fiona decided to file for divorce first. Norman sincerely didn't understand why and didn't want to listen to explanations. He stated that he would only agree to a divorce through the court. But Fiona didn't care. She didn't understand how she hadn't noticed the obvious before. His coldness, indifference, apathy. But now, everything would be different. Thanks to Whitney and her illness, Fiona understood who her husband Norman really was, and she didn't want to spend another minute with him. She moved out of the apartment, renting a room nearby the daycare where she worked. The first step was taken. Now she just had to wait for Sam to file for divorce. They would be happy, even in a rented apartment, even without money. Because he was her person, the person she had been waiting for all her life without even realizing it. And then Sam called her. Listen, I can't get a divorce, he said abruptly. What? Fiona was surprised. Are you kidding? Fiona, I'm sorry, I can't. And then he fell silent. The woman heard only his breathing, heavy, strained, as if he had just run a marathon. Sam, at least explain why, she exclaimed. I can't, sorry. And goodbye. The next 2 months became a nightmare for Fiona. She didn't live, she existed. She desperately longed for Sam and for the life they could have had. But that life she had already imagined didn't happen. But why did he change his mind? Could it be that he lied about his wife and they actually lived happily together? But there was never anything between him and Fiona. Did he want to use her? He had the opportunity. And Fiona wasn't such a valuable trophy for him to just come to spend a little time together. Whitney agreed to treatment, and she was getting better. Doctors said the tumor responded well to therapy, and there were chances that Fiona's mother-in-law would live for a few more years. Norman seemed to have forgotten about his mother. Fiona prepared her a dietary meal. It distracted the woman a little from worrying, and after 2 months, when Fiona left work, she was called by name. She turned around, saw Tiffany, Sam's niece. Fiona froze, unable to believe her eyes. "Hello." Tiffany approached her and smiled shyly. "I'd like to talk." "About what?" "About my dad," Tiffany sighed. "Maybe we could sit somewhere. He doesn't know I'm here." "Did something happen to Sam?" Fiona was scared. "Yes and no," Tiffany answered vaguely. "Listen, you can come to my place. I live nearby," Fiona offered. The woman's heart beat anxiously. "Okay, let's go." In the cramped room where Fiona lived after leaving her husband, Tiffany told her why Sam cut off communication with them. "You see, Helen, his wife got sick," Tiffany said. "Something with her heart. She was hospitalized, stayed there for 2 weeks. Then they released her home, said she shouldn't get upset. And Sam, well, my dad, he was almost going crazy, jumping around her." Tiffany suddenly grimaced, as if she was talking about something unpleasant. Then she fell silent. Fiona touched her knee. "Is everything okay with Helen now?" Fiona asked. "With Helen?" Tiffany's face twisted. It was always okay with her. Dad told her he wanted a divorce and that everything was settled, but then she immediately fell ill. It seemed suspicious to me, and my friend's mother works in the ward where she was hospitalized as a nurse. She told me that her attending physician, my mom's good acquaintance, agreed to come up with a fake diagnosis. Dad wouldn't leave a sick wife, you understand? "So Helen is healthy?" "Yes, she's healthy," Tiffany replied. "I told Dad, but he didn't believe me. Then he went to the ward to talk to that doctor, and she cracked under pressure. Anyway, Dad left Helen. I tried to convince him to come to you, but he doesn't want to." "Why?" Fiona was surprised. "Well, he says you'll never forgive him," Tiffany answered. "What kind of person is he, right? Old-fashioned or what? He's ashamed. He hopes you'll find your happiness with someone bolder and more decisive than him. Can you imagine?" "I can imagine," Fiona smiled. "I can imagine very well." "So, what are we going to do?" Tiffany asked sadly. "I'll do what my former mother-in-law told me to do," the woman quietly replied. "Put aside pride, so to speak, and I'll go to Sam. I don't want you to bring him to me in a wheelchair when we're both 80 years old." The next day, the train carried Fiona and Tiffany to Summerhool. Fiona was going to stay there forever, and 3 months later, Sam and Fiona got married. However, they had to return to the city where Fiona had lived before. She wanted her mother-in-law to attend her wedding as an honored guest. Fortunately, Whitney was well enough. After the wedding, Whitney approached Fiona and pulled her close. "I should be upset, but I'm happy. Strange, isn't it? I love you, Fiona, and I love my son." "Thank you." Fiona hugged her. "I love and respect you too." "I wanted to tell you something, Fiona. Don't delay with the grandchildren. I want to spoil your kids, darling." Tears welled up in Fiona's eyes, but she promised herself she wouldn't cry. She would never cry again. "Whitney, you'll have time.